Hello, Marijn. How are you
Hey,
doing?
how you doing? How you doing? I'm good. How are you?
So, for our viewers, of course, I'm Sohaib Saeed. I have with me Marijn van Putten, who is going to be very soon at the University of Leiden. Or shall I say that you're already at the University of Leiden?
No, no, soon I would say. I'm there, but I'm currently not employed. But in January I will be, so that'll be
You're
great.
there and gearing up for a big project on Quranic manuscripts. So, I'm very pleased to be with you today. And actually, we chat very often, and we've working together on some projects, including on a paper where we're looking at the qira'at, the meanings of the qira'at, and how that's been understood in tradition, in the tawjih literature, and how that would affect translation. So I don't know if I will be in person in Palermo in September, but there is a Sicilian conference where we have a paper which will be covering some of this. So a lot of my viewers, I think, already know you and some of your work, and they might have different perspectives on what it is that you do. And I was very glad that you agreed to this idea because I felt like there is so much interest amongst Muslims and amongst non-Muslims in the Quran and in studying the Quran. And sometimes, there is a really good confluence and conversation that happens between people who are studying from different perspectives, from different belief perspectives, different methodologies. And I think that our work together is reflective of that. Because you and I, we agree on a lot of things and we disagree on plenty of things, and
Right?
we get along just fine.
Yeah, yeah,
But then there can also be a kind of clash sometimes, and maybe I spend too much time on Twitter, but that's where I see it, where people sometimes are talking at cross purposes. There is sometimes misunderstandings, sometimes accusations, sometimes anger, conspiracy theories. So I thought, look, let's open a conversation,
yeah.
and that's really what it is, around studying the Quran as Muslims and as non-Muslims. And of course, from the beginning, I want to say I'm not suggesting that I am the representative of all Muslims, nor am I asking
Nor am
you
I the representative of all
to be the
non-Muslims. Yes,
representative
yes.
of all non-Muslims, because that wouldn't make sense. But we'll speak from our own perspectives and also think about others, that colleagues and friends and people that we've come across in our journeys, um, because I think that what will come out through that, hopefully, is people will see it's not so simple as a divide between one side and another.
Mhm.
Um, but let's allow the conversation to flow. Now, what I did a couple of weeks ago is I mentioned on Twitter that I'm having this conversation, and I didn't name you because I didn't want the
Mhm.
questions to be things that people specifically wanted to ask you, but rather on the topic of studying the Quran from Muslim and non-Muslim perspectives. So we got lots of really good questions, and both of us, Marijn and I, have last night gone through and picked ones that we thought could form a good basis for conversation. So I'm going to pull those up so that we can roughly proceed through them, and again roughly in order. So from the beginning, I thought this might be a good way to open. What is your motivation? And I'll take this as a question for both of us. What is driving you to
Mhm.
study the Quran? What do you expect to get out of it? And I suppose maybe with that we can take a look at this second question, because not many people came with this kind of take on it or this kind of tone. But I feel like this person is not necessarily alone in feeling this
No,
way.
no, I've definitely seen this kind of sentiment at times. Yes, yeah.
So Full Metalish is saying the opinions of non-Muslims on the Quran doesn't matter. That's point one. What are you
Mhm.
non-Muslims bothering to study Quran for? So in a way, that's another angle of saying what's your
Mhm.
motivation,
Right.
but in a slightly less welcoming way. Let's put it that way, right? So should we start with how you might like to answer this question?
Yeah, sure, sure. So to some extent, in my research, I'm often mystified myself why I'm interested in studying the things I do. I studied linguistics, and if you ask me like, why are you interested in languages, I'm like, I'm not sure. I just think they're cool. And why did I end up, I have a PhD in verbal linguistics, and I think verbal languages are the coolest languages in the world. Sorry, Arabic. But
Mm.
I don't know why. I just think they're interesting. And the same is true for the Quran, really. I was working on the history of Arabic. That's what interested me. And one of the reasons why I got interested in that was simply because I felt like it was one of the Semitic languages that really hadn't had a lot of study yet. That sounds very strange, but I really think, it was missing some kind of fundamental historical perspective specifically. And I felt I could add something to that. And as I was doing that, I was noticing that really the integration of the Quran into the study of the history of Arabic, it sounds absurd to say, wasn't really something that was done. And I was like, well, I really think I can do this. I think I have a perspective, from linguistics that can do something new with this text. And then I was like, well, and because I'm a historical linguist, and, I'm also used to working with ancient texts, editing text, these kinds of things. And, at this very moment, there's really an explosion of getting access to manuscripts and these kinds of things. And it's so cool to work with these really, really ancient manuscripts. And, that's what motivates me. That's why I'm interested in it. And I really felt like I was able to do something that other people weren't doing. So that's why I did it. And that's kind of what motivates me. Yeah.
So, I mean, related to this, I noticed on Twitter, I mean, maybe it was one person, but there was a bit of
Mm.
activity and flurry around a certain question about you because you were presenting something on manuscripts and somebody was questioning, like, do you have a qualification in Quranic manuscripts? And I don't know if they
Yeah. And
expected you to have a degree, I think a degree, like a
right.
BA degree in that, or is your PhD should have been in that, or you should have traditional ijaza in that, something. I'm not sure exactly what would have satisfied them.
Mm, mm.
But I mean, could do you?
Yeah, no, well, I don't, clearly. And it's impossible, of course. So this is what makes this discussion so funny. Yeah, it was like you don't have a degree in textual criticism, but you're doing textual criticism. Like,
Mm,
yeah, I mean, there's no degree in textual criticism of the Quran. There's no real degree of textual criticism of the Bible, even, So, I mean, you can get something much closer, but I mean, it's not really a field that is
I mean, you could
very
set up
well
a degree. You could teach.
right.
Yeah.
You could, but someone
But the
has to
nature of
start, of
research,
course.
isn't it, that you
Right.
have to go to the boundaries of what's
Yeah.
being done, and not everything exists on an undergraduate level.
Hmm. Or graduate level.
The
Yeah.
results of
No.
it, the conclusions of it,
Yeah.
can be presented to undergraduates.
Yeah.
But that's different.
And
Myself, like, what do I have a degree in? So I have degrees in philosophy. I have degrees in Quranic studies from Al Azhar. Tafsir and Ulum al Quran is what it is. I should decolonize that. It's called Tafsir and Ulum al Quran. And I have, then a PhD. But, in reality, my PhD is technically in Near and Middle Eastern Studies at SOAS University of London. I could say it's in Islamic studies. I can say it's in Quranic studies.
right.
But each time I'm stretching it a little bit because ultimately my research is my research, and then it gets examined by other people in the field who are deemed to be close enough in the field to assess my work. And then it is said, okay, now you have my specific degree, then it becomes in Tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran. But that's, my first piece of work, as a doctoral student is when I did it. Then after that, I'll do other pieces of research. I'll branch out into other things. Now, as somebody who is stronger than I was when I was a doctoral candidate, I'm not going to get a degree in all those things. I'm just
Right.
going to be a researcher in those things. I'll develop the tools and the
Yeah.
skills,
Yeah.
you
So,
know?
so, so that's the other point, right? Where yeah, you don't continue to have degrees in things, but your interests develop, your research develops, and kind of like, where you go to things like once you've gotten your degree, well, like I said, you just don't continue to have degrees. It's like you'll develop new interests, you'll develop new things to research, and you'll start doing things you haven't done before, and hopefully find places where nobody has done something before. Do it on a level where, of course, people are able to evaluate it, and this is where peer review is, of course, very important. But ultimately, it's a great merit of academia that anyone can, in principle, write something and do something, even if you don't have the obvious paper. That helps somewhat, but since it's usually it's double-blind peer review, you could technically start publishing without any qualifications whatsoever formally, and publish. And people have done this,
Yeah.
and for good reason. I think I'm thinking of May Shadel, for example, who's really done amazing work both in Quranic studies and early Islamic history, who's now doing his PhD, but published enough to make up like 6 PhDs already, even before he started.
I think maybe
Clearly,
sometimes the apprehension could come from, or the misapprehension could come from also a perspective, a maybe oversimplified perspective of what Islamic models of education are, because it's sometimes presented that everything has to be by ijaza, by a specific license from a sheikh. So I should receive from my sheikh, or receive from his sheikh, or receive from her sheikh, and going back and back through an isnad, and that exists and no doubt has its value. I went to Al Azhar, and there, I feel that what I have is an ijaza from the institution, right? So it wasn't so individualized to each thing, but it just means, okay, this person has passed the basic requirements to go and be involved in Islamic knowledge and Islamic research. But if we really look at the biographies of scholars, and we look carefully and look beyond the sheikh and ijaza part of it, you'd realize that the great scholars are the ones who went and did independent study, reading, and I mean even in the contemporary times. And in classical times, I'm sure, although I'm not expert in scholarly biographies, but I think that the genius scholars are the ones who really went far beyond what was handed to them, in terms of the ulum. And they read widely, they thought critically, they gathered things, they synthesized things, they discovered problems, they posited solutions to those problems. So I just want to say, within the Islamic model, I see it that way as well. That it's not completely at odds with this kind of Western academic mode that we are talking about. And of course, the Western academia is taken from Islamic academia anyway, right? It's all the degrees in university. That's our stuff, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. Do you want to touch upon this question of why would or what was the formulation exactly? Like it's useless for a non-Muslim to
who
study
cares
the Quran?
what
Who cares?
the opinions of non-Muslims doesn't matter. Well, I guess it doesn't matter to whom is the question.
Well, that too. So ultimately, like, people don't need to care, right? Like if people feel like I don't have anything useful to add for the mere fact of being a non-Muslim, I mean, it's just, go for it, I guess. But I'd like to think, I mean, I find a way of thinking about it very strange. I mean, to some extent, I mean, it's a sensible. Please, go ahead.
No, I think I see that you promote your work, right? And that's in academia considered very praiseworthy. It's outreach. It's, what do we call it? Public engagement, and so on. And people might see it as proselytizing. They might see that what you're trying to do is not push your work in order to reach a wider audience and make it more fulfilling for you, but actually that you're trying to convince people and get them to believe what you believe.
Right.
Maybe that's maybe
that's it. And it's like that's certainly not my goal. And also I think a way of thinking. I mean, it's such a bizarre thing to think about. It's like Islam's been around for 1600 years, and that's how many believers? 1.5 billion. It's like anything I do is not going to have that kind of effect. What I think is fun or interesting is, I mean, it is really cool to work with the Quran, especially because it is important to people, and I get to show it to people who think it's interesting on a different level, or look at it not just as a academic endeavor, but also see it from a spiritual point of view. And because of that, it has value, and it's very cool to have people appreciate what I do on that level. I enjoy that. I think it's fun, but it's not you know, that's not, it's not,
Yeah.
I don't care if people don't get that out of it. It's like, you know, people don't need to, but of course, I mean, the vast majority of the people that follow me on Twitter are Muslim and find the stuff I do valuable. And I think that's great. And, you know, just posting pictures of beautiful Quranic manuscripts
Yeah.
is you know, is value in itself. I mean, they're gorgeous, and everybody seems to appreciate that. So how do you feel about that? Why is there no value in non-Muslim modes of study of the Quran?
It's not only, I mean, modes of study, I guess,
Mm,
is a way of approaching this question.
mm,
Opinions, you know, I think anyone's opinion matters insofar as it's based on evidence. It doesn't really matter who
right.
says it. I think that's, for me, the correct Islamic attitude to it. I also feel like we shouldn't be, as Muslims, we shouldn't be sort of perturbed by the fact that Muslims study the Quran. By the way, let me be very honest with you
Mm,
in my own journey, right? So, I mean, I see people struggling with things, and I sympathize with them. I even empathize with them because I myself have been a young Muslim. I've grown up, experienced things, and things are new to you, and then they shock you and they surprise you, and you know. And I wasn't always in formal Islamic studies, and I have asked myself that question all the time: why is this person, not you specifically, but you know,
mm,
why are these people so interested in the Quran? And yes, I read stuff about Orientalism and Orientalists and
mm,
Mustashriqeen, right?
no.
And I don't know how much that's, you know, everyone credits this discussion to Edward Saeed, and I'm sure he's
Mm,
got something to do with it. But, you know, within Al-Azhar also, we studied a topic called Istishraq, and we studied about the
mhm,
history of Orientalism. We'll come to that as well. But the point is that forms my perspective on what would someone be doing reading
mhm,
the Quran, right? Probably they're out to undermine it.
mhm,
It's hard. It is hard for me because the Quran is so meaningful to me. My purpose, you know, to answer the question from myself, my purpose of studying the Quran is mainly a matter of iman. It's a matter of belief. You know, curiosity, sure, but you know, there's only so much time in the day for curiosity. But it's more that it is a mode for me of heightening my relationship with God by knowing better what it is that He sent down, and the things around that. But I would put a caution here because really, talib al-ilm culture, as we sometimes call it, can over romanticize this, or have a very naive view that all study of Islamic things is going to grow your faith. It's
mhm,
not as easy as that. It's not as simple as that. You know, when you investigate certain points, it's the easiest thing is just to be told, you know, if you like this sort of Sunday school, or we do it on Sundays as well, as it happens,
mm,
but
yeah.
you know, all Fridays are day. But for, you know, we have Sunday school version of Islamic topics, and that's fine. You know, like when you're young, and if you want to keep things simple. But then when you look into things in more detail, just picking up the books of the Islamic scholars, you would realize, wow, it's actually more complex than that. It's actually less certain than that. There's more
Mhm,
ambiguity here. There's more dispute over this point. Things which you're told are just straightforward. So unless you're prepared to absorb that kind of ilm,
mm,
that kind of ilm will lead you not to grow automatically in iman. It can lead to growth in iman if you have the right sort of mindset and approach, and keep going, right?
mhm, mhm,
It's the sort of thing that can throw you into doubt because you have to question something that was certain before. But if you base your iman on false certainties, or like oversimplified certainties, then when those things are uprooted, you say, oh my God, you know, my faith is, you know, and
yeah.
you know, sometimes see that in what people come and tell you, you know, oh, they left the faith some years ago, and you say, well, what was that about? And then they tell you, you're like, is that it?
Right, right,
You could have asked me that. I could have really
right,
helped you, but
right,
oh,
right, right,
nobody could answer my question. Anyway,
right. Yeah, yeah.
so what I'm saying is, therefore, I find it difficult when I'm seeing someone studying the Quran and they don't have within them that burning question of
Right,
like,
right.
of drawing closer to God thereby. But I guess, you know, I got more used to it over time, right? So it's
Mhm,
not so
mhm.
strange to me. But occasionally, I still ask myself, why?
Yeah. Right.
Like,
Right.
why are you putting even more effort than me? You're like, why are you spending more time than me? Why are you
Right.
publishing more than me, Marijn, on the Quran?
Sorry.
And that's okay. It's okay. No jealousy here. Actually, it's interesting how we first met, isn't it? Do you remember how we not met? Actually, we haven't met.
No.
But how we first got to talk to each other was around the topic of Ibrahim
Ibrahim. Yeah.
/ Ibrahim
Abraham.
in the Quran, and where these words were coming, because somehow on Facebook I came to know that you were looking at that question, and I said that I'm looking at that question, and I had been gathering lots of resources, and my resources still haven't yet led to any conclusion from my side, but you did publish a paper on the name of Ibrahim and its occurrences in the Quran and what that tells you about manuscripts, the relationship between the written form and orality. Whereas for me, the question remains, and you said this to me as well, that there's still a paper in this, maybe, if we figure out why the name Ibrahim seems to appear at specific points and not other points, that's, is there some semantic reason or some deeper reason other than sort of randomness?
Yeah, I mean that feels. I mean, at the same time, that's what it looks like. But it's exactly right. That's one of those frustrating things. That's how we got into contact, and I think you kind of hope like maybe he'll solve it, but I didn't solve it. I found something, but it's. But
I always feel when I see that paper, I feel that's my, on some level that's my paper. But I didn't do the work and research that you did. But we had the same question. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Now, the opinions of norms. Yeah, so I think one other thing I wanted to really underline here from a perspective of a Quran believer is in verse 82 of Surah An-Nisa, Allah says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. Now, one way that I was also taught, since some time I used to listen to Gary Miller lectures. I don't know if you know the mathematician Gary Miller. He has some really influential lectures on the Quran, the Amazing Quran it was called. So growing up, I heard that, and it really pushed me to understand certain things in a certain way. And one of those is, this ayah is a challenge, to come study the Quran, ponder on it closely, and go ahead and find any inconsistency, right? So given that I see it that way, and the tafsirs don't contradict that, by the way, then why should I feel like threatened that non-Muslims are studying the Quran, even that they're trying to undermine the Quran? So I think that it just has to be seen. And I think, again, like the way you said, if you want to ignore it, ignore it.
Right.
Why sort of go to that person's Twitter and say, stop doing this, right?
Right.
I'll tell you honestly, there was one person who messaged me. I'll keep them anonymous, of course. And they asked me about you. People ask me about you quite regularly, as it happens. They seem to think I have some insight into you. So he said, I am reading some of Marijn's stuff, and I feel like it's giving me a little bit of disturbance, in spiritually or mentally, or they used the word disturbance. I remember that, and I said, look, well then I think don't read his stuff then. Just stop reading it. And a few weeks later, he posted a refutation thread against you. And I thought, this is not the way. That's not the way. Sometimes people feel like if you have some doubts or some problems in your, conception of things, refuting it and going on the offensive is the way to do it. But I don't agree with that. And that's just my advice to my younger brothers and sisters. I think mostly brothers, but let's say to my younger brothers and sisters or older, is by all means look after your own faith. Don't read things, but what I'm telling you is the books of fiqh, Islamic fiqh, the books of tafsir, I don't like to romanticize these things. They've got so much good and so much benefit, but they can also shake you up. They can also disturb you. There'll be things in there that make you question your Sunday school version of Islam. So it's not just the non-Muslim scholarship and the opinions of non-Muslims, that will cause this kind of issue.
There was something you said. Oh yeah. So one last thing is like I lost my train of thought again. Let's
No, we can come back to it.
yeah, well, it might come back to me in a second. That's
Okay,
fine. Yeah.
so I mean, we can maybe look at a few more
Oh, you know,
questions.
I got it again.
Yeah.
I'm so close. So, okay, well, I'm sorry.
I'm sure as soon
interrupting
as
this
we
video
start
with
the
me.
next sentence, it will come back to you. But
Yes,
so
exactly.
there's
I
a
know.
question about actually the person wrote Islamophobia / Orientalism, which is interesting because that kind of brings the two concepts together in a way that is more, stark than it has to be.
Yeah.
But Orientalism in academia regarding Quranic Islamic studies. Now, I should say that Orientalism, in the first place, designates the academia concerning the East and including or particularly, Islamic, Middle Eastern kind of context. This is Orientalism, and there are other aspects of Orientalism as well. So, but later on, it's kind of become common to see it as inherently a negative term. Right? It was by itself. It didn't start that way, but of course, Edward Saeed and in particular his critique of Orientalism has given it another range of meanings, criticizing also the worst parts of what existed in Orientalism. But I'm saying that because I'm trying to understand why Islamophobia / Orientalism is, because Islamophobia, I think we'd all agree, is a bad thing, but Orientalism, I think, can be seen in different ways. But in academia regarding its history, how has it changed? Has it changed or not? And let's maybe take the other couple of questions sort of in tandem or nearby. Somebody's asking, do non-Muslim academics recognize that they are not immune to biases and assumptions? Do you? And do non-Muslims pursue traditional Islamic education to better understand the Quran? So that relates to, I brought up the issue of ijazat.
Right.
And I think that the part of the answer relates to even classical kind of Orientalism here. So let's maybe explore that. And let's maybe one more I'll put sort of here. We don't have to tackle them all at once, but why is the Islamic tradition ignored by non-Muslim academics studying Quran? When listening to them, it feels like the West was the first to do such a study and no past Islamic references are given. By the way, I think I've seen that critique even made against some of your threads, although I won't accuse you of that attitude, but let's see. Okay, so where do you want to start? Orientalism, history.
Let's start with Orientalism and Islamophobia. You're right, of course, that Orientalism originally had no negative connotation at all, and then with the publication of Saeed's book, it now does. Which is now now we call it Islamic studies or Middle Eastern studies, and which is of course kind of skirting around the problem.
And even then we have two branches of Islamic studies, at least commonly, like in Edinburgh University, for example, we have Islamic Middle Eastern studies. They study Islam there, and then we have another, which is the divinity and theology, religious studies. They study Islam there, and they have different ways of doing it because they've got different histories. And so the first of them, Islamic Middle Eastern studies, is within area studies. And area studies is generally where Orientalism fits in. It's looking at the other, looking at the region, linking religion to culture, geography, language, history, and so on.
Yeah. So obviously, I mean, I think there's very clear examples. In the past, both of I think very very negative, biased views towards Islam, I guess, towards the other in general, and to some extent that's just not something you can completely avoid. I mean, it's not something, and that kind of cuts into the other question that came up as well. That's something you can completely avoid, and certainly not at its time. I think Nodek's Geschichte des Korans, the history of the Quran, is one of the most brilliant books ever written. But every now and then you read it and you go, that's kind of racist. And
of its time, as we say nowadays, it's of its time.
Right, and you know that's part of it, and I think the study has developed. I think Orientalism has really become a negative term to the point that it's being avoided, which is kind of irritating as well. Like, I mean, I avoid it. I know other people who still, you know, proudly use the moniker, so to speak, to talk about it because it's a reasonable way of talking about it. And we are in the part of that tradition, you know, in whatever adjustments have been made. The Western study of Islam is Orientalism,
Yeah.
and so how do you go about
And
that? And
Leiden,
that,
for
that
example, Leiden
like,
has a particularly rich
yeah,
history,
yeah,
and
for sure,
much publication, manuscript editing,
yeah,
translation. So many things have been centered in the Netherlands, as they have also
yeah,
in the UK, for example, Germany,
hmm,
a
hmm,
major center for Orientalism, and the results of those things, Muslim scholars have often received positively, and they've
hmm,
recognized the value. But I think it's a little bit like, okay, it's now very closely allied with the concept of colonialism,
hmm,
and of course now decolonization,
hmm,
whereby you're sort of saying, okay, are those positives worth it? If we say,
hmm,
okay, but we made train lines for you in your in your
hmm,
country,
hmm,
so it's okay that we took all your resources and stuff. But I think that there's different attitudes amongst Muslim scholars towards Orientalism in general. There
hmm,
are sort of more positive or balanced views. But there are also some views that some of the Muslims, or some people within the Muslim world, if we can put it that way, absorbed the ideas of the Orientalists in a very bad way,
hmm,
and so they became very skeptical towards Hadith and
right,
towards the Quran itself, and so there's a kind of backlash against some of these things within the competing trends in the Muslim world. So Muslim scholarship does often characterize Orientalism as a bad thing, and that's not always linked to the sort of Saeedian
hmm,
points
hmm,
in reality. But I guess the general idea that those people were out to undermine Islam.
hmm,
Why were they out to undermine Islam? Perhaps in the service of empire. Um,
right,
Understanding the other, we can control the other.
right,
So I think there's a lot of validity in that
hmm,
critique, but
I think
at the
so,
same time, it
yeah.
would be unjust to kind of see that as the only thing that was going on. You know, I think
and and
sometimes when
and
you
and, and,
operate,
and even yeah, so even you know for scholars like Nondika, that certainly even if it was a tool for colonialism, and you know a lot of this study I think to some extent indeed function as a you know as a tool for these kinds of things. It doesn't even necessarily mean those authors, even the ones where you feel like you have kind of problematic views by now, um, had that as their goal. I would be quite surprised if you would have asked Nildeke, like, you know, why do you study the Quran? Why do you study Islam? That he would have said, well, because I want to undermine Islam. I don't think that, you know, he did not see validity in it.
but okay, so
Had his
couldn't you say
right.
here though,
Mm,
why you do things is not
mm,
always a purely individual and conscious
yes.
thing. So we are shaped by the context in which, like for example, in order to get a job, we
Mm,
have to jump through certain hoops, and we have to use certain language. We have to impress funders in certain ways. You got to you've got to tap into the zeitgeist and the norms, and you've got to prove yourself to the powers that be, and the powers that be are serving other powers that be.
right.
Academia is, of course, in many ways in service of
Yeah,
power,
for
and
sure. I mean, and which
and
is true.
struggling to fund what they do, so they themselves have to. So I just mean to say, maybe there's an extent to which they were more than
Mhm.
they consciously intended in
Yeah,
service of
for sure.
what we could call nefarious purposes, leave the value
Yeah,
judgments to individuals.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But maybe even today, like, I mean, without intending to, we working in academia as Muslims or as non-Muslims could end up serving causes which um, are not what
Yeah.
not what we are conscious of doing, and therefore, maybe academia as a whole is trying to undermine Islam, right? Like,
Yeah.
how could we address
Right,
this
right,
charge?
right. Yeah, I mean, it's so this kind of, I mean, you know, to some extent, we're out of control with these kinds of things.
Because
Not
we're
that,
still,
right?
invading.
Yeah.
Iraq and
Yeah.
Afghanistan, and
Of course. And you know, it would be ridiculous to say that these things are not, that, you know, those kinds of movements don't come with renewed interests in these kinds of fields, and so obviously there is a you know, a connection there, and that
and
connection is something.
counterterrorism is the other
Right.
sort of
Yeah.
thing where funding can be received only if you prove that you are
Right.
countering extremism and terrorism, which of
Yeah.
course only exists amongst Muslims, you know,
Right.
according to
Right.
some of the funders and the government.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. No, so it's and you know, that kind of also goes into the other question, you know, are non-Muslims aware of their biases and that they have biases? I mean, um, I, I tend to find this question irritating, but I try to see where it comes from. Of course, we're aware of it. The whole point of academia is to try and study a subject and try to get rid of as much bias as possible, to talk about it in a way that we can communicate, that we can get to the truth. That is the point. Which is not to say that we are all perfect examples of doing so. I
yeah.
don't think anyone is. Everybody has their biases, and it will affect my judgment. It will affect your judgment, and it will affect anyone else's judgment.
Mm.
Um, and so the irritating part about the implication is that, you know, the implication is that I'm not doing everything about it to counteract it.
I mean, I
The
don't know.
non-area.
That could be the implication, but
Mm.
this question
No,
to
no. I mean,
me.
that's the part that irritates me. It's
All
not
right, okay,
necessarily
yeah.
the
I mean,
implication. Yeah,
what the question sort of implies to me is, I think sometimes people, as Muslims engaged in Islamic scholarship in general, whether in the Western Academy
Mm.
or just within Muslim contexts, um, obviously have certain assumptions,
Yeah.
you know, and you know, the Quran is from God, right? So
Right.
we're not sort of out there to investigate that question. Neither is Western academia, of course, but there would be an acknowledgement of certain quote unquote biases or beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, of course, secular academia, just by calling it secular,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
there is an implication that is objective.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't proceed from biases and assumptions or beliefs.
Right.
And I think the point is, do people operating in that space actually see themselves that way as objective, neutral,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore better able? And sometimes people say this out loud, you know, like
Mm-hmm.
for you know, accurate knowledge on Islam, I would go to the non-Muslims because they are objective.
Yeah. Yeah. I find well. I mean, it's a good point, and I think it's ridiculous. They're like, I mean, the idea that a non-Muslim would for some reason um, come come with a better perspective, I think doesn't make any sense. I don't necessarily think it makes sense either to assume that a Muslim by definition has a better perspective on this. I think you know, go from the data, which is a very secular approach to this, but uh, it's and it plays a role, and you see this, and it makes for the strange position of, you know, Islamic studies being in some way um, very much disconnected, and it's only, you know, now in part, you know, due to the result of colonialism, of course, that there's more of an integration of Muslims within the field, which I think is incredibly important. You know, it's a very strange situation, and people ask me that every now and then too. You know, don't you think it's weird that, you know, there's hardly any Muslims in Islamic studies? I'm like, well, I mean, there's a lot of study in you know, in Islam,
Yeah.
in by Muslims. It's just we don't call it Islamic studies. It's kind of split in a way that feels weird, and which I think
Well,
we should acknowledge feels weird.
I
Yeah.
have a way of putting this. I think I
Mm.
might have mentioned it to you before, but in a way, like colonialism has led to immigration.
Mm-hmm.
So like sometimes people of my kind of color would say, we are here because you were there. You know,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
you came into our lands and did all the things that you did. And
Right.
so, and then eventually you needed bus drivers and you know, fruit pickers or whatever. And we came, you know, my parents and people of their generation came because of that. So we became part of Britain, and you know, I am British, I'm Scottish, and some people don't like that. You know, and it's not very politically correct to say it, but a lot of people, of course, don't like that, and they don't see that we're not really British, though, are you?
Right.
I mean, like, we'll tolerate you, but when it comes to the crunch, you're not
Mm-hmm.
really, are you? Right? So
Right.
there is
Right.
that. But then I think that, you know, without wanting to exaggerate the parallel, but just to explore it, Orientalism has led to this immigration of Muslims into Islamic studies, Western Islamic studies,
Yeah.
and people like myself have come up, you know, and there are people, there are plenty of others beside me and people before me, of course. But more and more, we are present in the conferences. I was just at the British Association of Islamic Studies conference in Edinburgh, overrun with Muslims, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in a good way, right?
Yeah. No, I mean,
Positive sense. And that's what's happening. And I think, again, there are probably some people who don't like that.
yeah,
And
I
we
think
wouldn't
that's
use the
true.
word racist or whatever, or Islamophobic necessarily, but let's say for whatever reason they feel uncomfortable that the field is changing
Yeah.
as a result of it.
Yeah, I think that's true, and but I ultimately do think it's a good thing. You know, I feel that there, in the way we approach this field, you know, this shouldn't matter, but it's worth appreciating. You know, the differences between, say, biblical studies and Islamic studies. Of course, the vast majority of people who are in biblical studies, not everyone, but they're Christian, and it's
Or
very
started
strange
out
that,
Christian, at least.
or started out Christian, either way, but that's certainly there, and that's not the case in Islamic studies in the West, and that's kind of weird. Like, it's not. It's. I think it's something that will change with time, but it's worth, and I think it's valid to see that, and to not pretend like that's not the case. And there is, because of it, I think we have Islamic studies sometimes has a different way of speaking about Islam in a way that biblical studies doesn't quite. You know, biblical studies, people, to some extent, you know, the non-belief in a text is considered a non-biased approach. And you sometimes get that, you know, there's this automatic assumption that obviously, you know, the Quran isn't true, etc. Which is, of course, not the non-biased approach. The non-biased approach is finding a way to talk about this where that ultimately is not the point. And this is, I think this is very important, something people sometimes misunderstand. It's like, my study of the Quran, it's not the point to show that it's not from God or whatever. I'm not interested in the question. It's
Okay,
not.
so
It's
let me put it to you directly,
right.
because I've had this put to me, like people message me and they say, I heard that Marijn is trying to undermine the Quran
Right. Well, I'm not.
in Africa.
No. So you know, it's not. It's not. That's not. It doesn't
Or to undermine the
interest me.
Qur'at, because I think some people
Right.
have looked at your work and
Yeah.
what they've walked away with
Yeah.
is your attempt is to show that everything is very human. Maybe that's it. Like it's very
Mm.
human and not from God.
Yeah. I mean, so you know, the way I think of this is, I don't think. I mean, so I'm absolutely not interested in undermining Islam. That's the first part, or the Qur'an for that matter. But I do, you know, I studied the Qur'an with an assumption that it does not necessarily come from the prophets, and which is about as close as we can get from a secular perspective to say something about this. And that doesn't mean that it isn't, or that we can say significant things about what the Quran was like in the early period. But I do. I mean, I think if you study at what the patterns, how does this develop? How do we see the readings work? There's a human element in there, and the human element is not just Muhammad; it's other people too. I think the outcome of my research is incredibly boring because on this level, because it's not doing anything to the text in the sense that, like, you know, I'm not saying, you know, the Quran's. I mean, every now and then people accuse me of this, but it's really, you know, I think if you look at the Qur'an and stuff I'm interested in, you know, I'm obsessing over whether there's imala here or there, whether there's a hamza here or there, has absolutely zero effect on what the meaning of the text is. And There's some parts where it gets interesting, but where it gets interesting, very often it becomes incredibly difficult to tell, okay, is this person, did they innovate this reading? And even if I use this kind of wording, it's like, if a person is reading in a way that his teacher wasn't, people go, come at me and they're like, well, yeah, but that's because he had other teachers. Like, yes, exactly. So he chose to do something differently from the person before that, and this is a choice, and this is to some extent, and
I mean,
so I'm not interested in, like, sometimes we can't reconstruct what the process was, and we can't tell if a person innovated or took it from a different tradition. And we cannot know for certain whether a prophet said all of these words in the exact same way, but it's, in very many cases, it seems very unlikely that happened. Um, is that undermining it? I don't think so. I think the message of the Quran is basically untouched in all of this, and I think the vast majority of the text is basically agreed upon by all the readers, and I think that's significant. That tells us something and gives us more confidence that that's
okay,
something
so
close. Yeah.
I want to focus in on this point in just a moment, and I want to talk to you. I want you to tell me about your paper on the grace of God,
Yeah.
because I find it funny in a way, ironic and a bit sad that of all people that some take objection to is you and others like our friend Haytham Siddiqui, for example, who have published some works on Qur'at and manuscripts and so on. And people feel that of all people that you or Haytham are out to undermine the Quran. Whereas, okay, what your purposes are, let's put that aside.
Right.
Okay, because you and Haytham might come from different places on this, right? But the point is, you're doing a certain work, which the conclusions and the results of that have a remarkable effect in actually bolstering what we would call the traditional account of the collection of the Quran, a traditional account of the preservation. I think as a Muslim word, preservation is maybe not one that you want to use, but from our perspective, what you have found out and what you have argued, not what you believe in your opinion, that's not really of concern. Non-Muslims' opinion doesn't matter. Well, the point is your data and how you analyze that data is very useful for us to say, well, you know what? A great deal of what our scholarship has said has turned out to be very accurate. And this can increase our confidence in the Quran that we have today. So I'll ask you in a moment to elaborate on how that is, but I wanted to say something about this human element. Again, like, people have started to make this dichotomy, which disturbs me from an Islamic scholarly perspective, right? Because as a person working in Islamic scholarship, I am human, and I'm aware of my own possibility of human error. I'm very aware that I'm not ma'soom, I'm not infallible. I believe that the Prophet, peace be upon him, is ma'soom. Okay, I don't believe that anyone after him is ma'soom. I believe that there's a power and a strength in the collectivity and the agreement of the Sahaba, the companions, on something. But I'm also aware of historical data that on some things that we have been saying and insisting that they were all agreed on something, sometimes it's not exactly like that. We have Ibn Mas'ud, there's something going on there. There's a bit something going on in Kufa, as my friend and brother Ramon Harvey has been writing about. So what I'm saying is, to talk about the human involvement, human element, is actually being realistic, and it's being faithful actually to our tradition, because any human involved, from those who were writing it down in the with this kind of pen, but they were writing it down in the presence of the Prophet. I believe there are scribes writing in the presence, but they themselves, that's much better. Yeah,
yes.
They themselves would have known that they could make a mistake, right? This whole thing could have been taken care of by angels. We could look at the whole thing as miraculous or magical, or however you want to put it. But look, I believe in a human tradition, a remarkable human tradition that has preserved the Quran, but it's preserved it in a way that actually exists in the real world. That's what I'm going to say, right? So as I think we'll come around to the Qur'at issue. We'll see what we can fit in, because it's obviously a massive discussion. Maybe we'll elaborate more another day. But the fact of the Qur'at reflects how the Quran was preserved rather than are the Qur'an preserved or not preserved. They are the preservation,
Right.
but they're an aspect of the preservation,
Yeah.
along
Yeah.
with the written preservation and the small variations we have between even the master Masahif. Okay, come to the grace of God, because I want you to, impress my Muslim viewers how you saved our religion.
Shall I share my screen real quick? I'll bring up
Sure.
the thing. So this is my article. It's open access, so you can read it if you like. But yeah, and a lot of people have gotten to this point. So basically, I go through the specific orthography of early Quranic manuscripts and I compare them across each other, and I show that even in places where it has absolutely no effect on the pronunciation, the reading, or anything of the Quran, the same spellings are being used again and again. And I used an example. I used Ni'matullah, that is the grace of God, or Ni'mat Rabbika, that kind of stuff. And I look, and Ni'ma can be written either with the tam maftuha or tam marbuta, and that has no effect on the meaning. It has no effect on the pronunciation of the text, the reading, or anything. But it is always spelled either with a ta or with a tam marbuta, and it's basically 50-50 in the mushaf as we have it today. But actually, if you start looking at early manuscripts, you'll see that the same spelling is used over and over and over and over again in all these different manuscripts. And then I scroll down so far that is gone. I'll find it here.
You must have some pictures. Oh,
yeah. And so as I show in this overview, there's like 4 exceptions across like hundreds of places I looked at in the Quran. So what this shows is that the Quran was being copied extremely accurately, letter by letter, copying, if there was a tamabuta in the original text, they copied that. If there was a tamaftuha in the original text, they would copy that. And what this shows is that all of these manuscripts must have been copied from a single source. They all go back to a single source text, an archetype. So these were not being written down from memory or memorization. They were really being written down from a written exemplar, copied letter by letter, very accurately and very precisely. Now, what we get out of that is the conclusion that yes, there was a source text. There was a starting point. There was a single point, and then distributed across the Islamic Empire, which is already quite nicely in line with what Islamic history says. And then the question is, well, when did that happen? Well, many of these manuscripts that we have are so early, they've been radiocarbon dated, but also on other bases. We have good reasons to think that, they're the latter half of the 7th century. Well, if we have multiple manuscripts from the latter half of the 7th century that go back to a single archetype, when was the archetype? Well, it can't have been much later than the 650s. It could technically be earlier, but 650s is perfectly in line with the traditional narrative that Uthman standardized text. It's clearly a standardization effort. And what's really surprising is that so far we haven't found any manuscripts that disagree with this, except for one, which has been erased and the standard text has been written over it. This is the Sana palimpsest, which clearly suggests that there was a real move towards this, the standard text. And that was very early, yeah.
So I guess, let me maybe pull up the questions again. I can do that. So someone had asked, opinions of non-Muslims, why bother? So I guess what I would say to this kind of situation again is, a Muslim could have done that research that you did, but you did it, right? And that's great, and it doesn't really matter and then who did it. I cannot see a difference in the sense of like what came out of being a Muslim or not being a Muslim. The point was applying a methodology. And I'd be very happy if more Muslims got involved in the type of research that you do. And I hope that actually they will, and they'll be inspired by seeing the results. Or if they feel like, okay, I really hate Marijn's methodology, then, let's see a better one. I think we'd all welcome that. I don't think that your job is
For
not
sure,
under threat
of
from
course,
anyone,
yeah.
so you can welcome that there's going to be different approaches, and that's really what people sometimes don't understand about scholarship and academia in general.
Mm-hmm.
Despite the fact that people can be affected by the same human pettiness and whatever, but for the most part, we just want to see the level of discussion keep rising and growing, right? So I wanted to bring up this one in relation to what you've said, right? So someone might say regarding your piece of research here, well, okay, so you're just telling us what we already knew because our tradition already
Right,
said that, right?
right.
So, so maybe you can help us understand the significance. But in more general, why is okay? We can take these together, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Pursuing traditional Islamic education, to what extent have you perhaps needed to do that or need to do that sometimes? Why is Islamic tradition ignored? Let's say including secondary sources, everything is seen as a primary source, but we don't listen to the
Right.
Muslim scholars and take what they're saying as important. And I think that you are in many ways an exception to this, but I think that we also see that there is a problem here. And sometimes it's presented like, okay, we figured this out and we've cracked the, we've Columbused Islamic studies or the Quran. So yeah, what's your reflection on these points?
Yeah. So I mean, I haven't pursued any traditional Islamic education, which is not to say that I.
Tajweed with the teacher?
No.
I will
I
teach you.
haven't. But
Just
I
come to
mean,
me, you know me.
yeah, I could, I guess. I mean, it's been tempting at times. Which is not to say I don't use similar sources. Right. Well, it's probably just out of screen, but the Nashr is up there in the Jazari. That is the way to work with the 10 Quranic reading traditions. And what I find funny is that very often I find people who come at me, trying to criticize me. They open up, some stupid Qur'an dictionary. It's like, no, you can't use that. You have to use actual sources. And I've worked with the Taysir. I personally hate didactic poems, so I don't really go through the Shatibiyya. I'd rather
So the
read the
Tafsir
Taysir
of
instead.
Abu Amr
Yeah,
al-Dani, right? And
Adani,
I remember
yes.
you saying something about Adani, like maybe you've mentioned it on Twitter sometimes, that you're finding more and more that his observations about the different masahif turn out to be very accurate.
Yeah.
And of course, like again, we already believed him, because he's our
Right.
bro,
Right.
our
Right.
sheikh, our imam. We already accepted what he said. But at the same time, I think a lot of times as Muslims, we see the value that somebody from outside, sorry to put it so starkly, over there in the Netherlands,
Right.
says, actually, our Spanish scholar got it right. Confirmation. And actually, we as Muslim scholars should be engaging in confirmation. This is called tahqiq. You shouldn't just say, well, because someone said it, that's it.
Right.
Now we have digitized manuscripts that have been preserved, previous to that, looted and so on, from different parts of the world, and now there's ways of studying them that weren't available at the time of Adani. It is amazing to see the level of accuracy that someone like him was able to capture. At the same time, there might have been some things he says that are wrong based on what we are able to look at now. And scholarship, Islamic scholarship within Muslim context, also should proceed in that way, rather than just tradition. As I see it, shouldn't be all about just repeating what was said in the past.
I think that's a very important point. What we try to do in scholarship is either confirm or disconfirm what we already believe. And every now and then it comes out that there's good reasons to believe the story. And actually, from a purely historical point of view, we really would like to be able to access independent confirmation for example, the story of the canonization of Uthman. First of all, because we have multiple narratives that are slightly different, and it would be nice to be able to say, well, which one of these is correct? Because, well, they all technically have a truth claim, and turns out that the traditional story here seems to be the one that is also most broadly adhered to. But nevertheless, I mean, that's not always the case. Sometimes, orthodoxy is not in line with what's true, or orthodoxy has changed over time. We can actually look at the sources again. It's like, well, where do we take
And
this?
again, just I'd like to
Yeah.
underline
Mm,
here, and this is maybe
mm,
just a stark way of putting it.
mm,
The deen, religion, is one thing,
mm.
and Islamic scholarship is another thing.
Right,
Yes, there's a close relationship between these two things,
right,
but sometimes Islamic scholarship can be wrong about something. It doesn't mean the deen is wrong. It doesn't
right,
mean
right,
revelation is wrong or the religion is in crisis, because Muslims may have misunderstood a minor point.
right, right.
Muslims have differed and disagreed about fundamental points of creed,
Right.
somewhat fundamental, right? About how to understand God and his attributes and all sorts of things.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, like, how exactly were the masahif, how many masahif were sent, or like what is the nature of the differences between the
Hmm.
masahif? Were they
Hmm.
intended or not intended? These are things which scholarship can revise. And I'm wary about bringing up the word standard narrative right now, because it's become
Mm.
very, very hot
Yeah.
debate, and people will want to know which side is Sohaib
Right,
on.
right, right.
Look, the way I see it, like somebody used the word standard narrative, and they said there are holes in the standard narrative. Now, I understood from that what the person intended to say is the narrative means the scholarship. It doesn't mean the deen, right?
Right.
So some people went crazy about this because they accused him of seeing holes in the deen, and
Hmm.
some as well, people who are actually, they have a hobby of attacking Islam. They also said, oh, look, even when this Muslim scholar says that there's
Right.
holes in the narrative of Islam, it's not the narrative
Hmm.
of Islam.
Hmm.
Narratives, by their nature, we're talking here about scholarship,
Yeah.
and scholarly narratives. For example, in my field of tafsir, there's narratives about the history of tafsir. And there's two types of tafsir: tafsir bil ma'thur, tafsir bil. This is a narrative. It's just a way
Hmm.
of framing things, of encapsulating the data in a certain way, interpreting it, telling a story. And then you say, you know what, that's not really a great way of looking at it, because these various things don't fit that story. Let's try to tell the story in a
Right.
better way.
Right.
And
And
by
that's
doing that,
exactly what a hole in a narrative is, of course.
right.
When you,
And so you're
yeah,
aiming to get towards a better narrative, which is therefore more the truth.
yeah,
And therefore, like, for me, that would bring us closer to the reality of the deen,
right.
right? So I hope that I hope that doesn't get me into trouble just bringing up the word, but I feel like it's important to distinguish these two things, because people get into a
Sure.
crisis just from hearing the word holes
Hmm.
in the standard narrative. Although I kind of
Right.
wish you'd
Right.
never said those words.
Right, right. Yes. I mean, it's well, it's certainly made the internet interesting, and certainly, I mean, that narrative has obviously played into interest, by people on Twitter in my work as well. I'm not unaware of that either. But ultimately, I perfectly agree with you. Like, ultimately, we're looking for the truth, and if we see that there are holes in any narrative, we need to plug those and find a real story. And I mean, when we're talking about, I don't know, differences in the must-haves, like, okay, maybe oh, I don't know, the wa was supposed to be a fa, and it was a mistake. It's like, that's really not going to change what the Quran has to say. Like ultimately, that's not, nothing really. I mean, depends on how you formulate, of course, your own faith in this kind of thing, but nothing has to lay in a balance for this. But it requires some flexibility about thinking about how to think of this history. And ultimately, history is not something known for sure, and it will never be known for sure. But as we get more data, and this is why, in 2022, we sometimes have to do a better job at making sense of a story than, maybe a Danny did in, what is it, 1200s?
Because we can build on
Um,
what he did.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, for
And if
sure.
he hadn't done what he's done, we wouldn't have even known there was a subject to study.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so it's always an appreciation. It's always,
Hmm.
as they say, on the shoulders of giants. Well,
Yeah,
but it's not always, is it? Because that's
yeah,
I think the point.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Sometimes you've pointed out to me that you feel that we've used the word Western enough times that people
Right,
have
right.
got used to what we're saying. But within Western Quranic studies, or Islamic studies more generally, there is sometimes a tendency to dismiss especially secondary works. And Walid Saleh in Tafsir Studies has pointed this out as well, that there's a kind of assumption that Muslims writing on these topics are kind of going to be uncritical, and therefore why would we study their works? Why would we quote their works?
No, I mean, I think it's a very important point, and I think this is true. I think it's not as often true as people make it out to be every now and then. But at the same time, I've had times there where I feel like I've come up with something brilliant, and then I open up some medieval work. I'm like, okay, well, maybe I am brilliant, but clearly someone was brilliant before me. And
it's the Orientalists do it to us as well, so it's good that our guys are doing it to you.
Yes. And so that's one side of that, and it's like, and yeah, I mean, sometimes of course, working the qira'at, there's so many people working on the Quran and the text of the Quran, and nobody ever bothered to even look what's in the Qira'at, which sometimes can really help their story, and sometimes really undermines whatever they're trying to say, and sometimes it doesn't matter at all. But it's just that it didn't occur to them to even look. It's very strange. This is central. This is the text of the Quran, and it's like, well, we're just going to deal with one of them, which happened to become popular in the 20th century. That's a strange thing of going about it. And
so that's the question that came. I mean, it's a related question about hafsonormativity. Of course, it's a word that we've popularized now on Twitter. But even in academic circles, as you're saying, sometimes people are neglecting the multiplicity of qira'at in their analysis. I think we probably touched on qira'at a little bit, maybe enough for today, so to try to attempt it as a separate topic.
But I think
I did want to I did want to touch on the work that we're doing together, because we have been reading together books of what is we're calling it Tawjih al-Qira'at. That's one of the names of the genre. Sometimes it's called Ihtijaj al-Qira'at or Ilal al-Qira'at, and it's a genre of works from the early times, particularly between the time of Ibn Mujahid and his civilization, up until a time which is roughly when Az-Zamakhshari's tafsir appears, which may or may not be related, but just it's a few hundred years in which there's several, quite a few works which are specifically looking at why why each qira'ah is the way it is, linguistically speaking, and the different meanings and shades of meaning between them. And it's very interesting to see how Muslim scholars analyzed that and understood that. And, that experience of reading it together, actually, I've found very fruitful. And I think it's a genre that even typically is neglected by everyone, I think, for the most part, except for a few specialists writing in that field. But in our paper, which hopefully will come out, maybe in a couple of years, I want people to actually see that and understand that the interest that can be in that field. But what's happening there is we're appreciating something in Islamic scholarship, aren't we? So rather than assuming that we should bypass what Muslims have said about these readings, that would be crazy. Like, once you know that it exists, you can't ignore it. But most people don't know it exists, so they ignore it.
No, it's exactly right, and that doesn't necessarily mean so some of these works sometimes come off as extremely post hoc, trying to explain something that is difficult to explain, and it's like, well, that's an unsatisfying answer, but I don't have a better satisfying answer. But so that happens. But every now and then you read this, like, wow, that's actually a really, really insightful analysis, and maybe I would not have gotten to what I'm looking at had I not looked at this. And so that's there. So these traditional sources can be. I mean, it's such a font of knowledge, and even today. So I've just come back from a conference in France where I talked about vocalization of the Quran, where I felt like I wasn't doing anything special, because I felt like I was essentially just translating what technically Al-Yazidi said, but it's being transmitted by Ibn Sarraj,
Mm.
about the vocalization. And of course, Al Yazidi is the transmitter of Abu Amr. He dies 200 Hijri. He was alive when these manuscripts were being written. He knew exactly how all of this stuff works and lays it out in great detail. And I come give a talk, and what I basically did is like, well, this is what Al Yazidi said,
Right.
and it's correct. And people really go, wow, I had no idea this was
Yeah.
around, and or you've done such detailed studies. Like, no, actually, I just read the text and and it told me what it was. I think I could have figured it out without it, but it was sure useful that it was around to kind of put that together. It's like that knowledge is there.
Mm.
And so often we kind of lose track of the fact that this knowledge even exists, and we end up
And in
reinventing the wheel.
fact, I mean, I'm doing it again. I'm bringing up the narrative thing, but
Mm-hmm.
you see, what we encounter there is a narrative that precedes what is
Mm-hmm.
now the standard narrative. And then by reading those works, we're actually trying, with limited human ability, to tap into the mindset of those who were reciting those qira'at,
Yeah.
transmitting them, selecting between them, explaining them, debating them, critiquing them sometimes, right?
Yeah.
And trying to understand, okay, why and what does that tell us about their understanding of what the qira'at are, where they've come from, what is the relationship of the human relationship with the readings and with the Quran itself as a transcendent reality that binds it, right? So that for me is the most important thing we could be doing, rather than debating about what somebody said on YouTube or whatever, is let's actually refresh our niyyah, as we say, make a fresh intention to go and study our tradition from its sources, from primary sources.
And now this will be one of the things that we've said on YouTube, so that's going to be
I
interesting.
know I've discussed this stuff, but my students who study tafsir with me, they know this, because like I don't make a whole point about the trying to drive some narrative by the qira'at. I'm just saying, let's read the tafsir but we have to understand what the mufassir is saying. And if we impose a strange narrative onto past tafsirs, we'll actually get distressed. How could a Tabari say something like that? Astaghfirullah. A Tabari was like almost a kafir because look what he said about this qira'ah, which is a qira'ah mutawatir. Well, it can't be. You have to actually revisit. Okay, maybe my very comfortable assumptions in the 20th, 21st century, need to be kind of revised in light of what I'm seeing that the early scholars were doing and how they saw things. Okay, that's enough trouble for now.
Yes.
Let's see. We've got maybe a slightly different angle, a couple more things that we could touch on perhaps. So someone has brought up, how can studying the Quran prove its miraculous nature? How does the Quran engage with us on a deep psychological level? So that's one type of question received. A bit related to this, has a non-Muslim academic, that would be you, ever tried to approach the Quran from a spiritual perspective, or does he confine himself to just an academic basis? Well, they assumed it was a male. Does an academic approach hinder a person from seeing the truth of the message? Okay. And we got one from someone who's told us they're an Orthodox Christian. We believe that one must be spiritually illumined to properly read our scriptures as holy scripture as opposed to historical artifact. So he's asking me, how do you understand this as a Muslim concerning the Quran? Could I, for example, read it spiritually? Great question. And last one in this kind of family is, how does someone like yourself deal with the frequent Quranic injunctions to reflect, right? So that's the content of the Quran, is saying reflect on it and believe in it. Don't ignore this warning. Claims for truth which permeate the Quran itself. I think we can all see what is being referred to here. Is there not a single verse that moves them? I have a little story about this which we'll come back to, but let's take a step back here and see that there's a question, I guess, about modes of studying the Quran. And I think that I would say that there are ways that I study the Quran in the mode of a believer, which you probably don't engage in.
Right.
But there are many things that we overlap in, like literally what we can work on together and collaborate. We bring our different learnings and skill sets to that. But then there are things which I would go and do, and I would ponder on verses, and I would think of it spiritually, and that's where we may diverge. because I think the key thing for me is, the Quran as guidance. The content of the Quran is there for guidance and, for effecting some kind of change in me, some kind of response in me, rather than it being an artifact and interesting from a linguistic level or whatever else. So I think there's so many different ways. I mean, they mentioned psychological reading. Proving its miraculous nature, I would say one thing here, which is, I mean, I don't know how relevant this is, but I'll just throw it out anyway. I think that there is a tension between reading the Quran from a tafsir perspective and from an i'jaz perspective. Because mostly I'm interested and involved in the tafsir perspective. In terms of scholarship, I'm focused on that, because that is about explaining what the Quran means. And I think that the proving that the Quran is miraculous is a different type of activity, and sometimes these things cannot sit well together. And I see that often when you see particular examples given or claims made that such and such is a miracle, you have to ignore what the verse actually means. You have to impose a meaning on there for that to make sense. And the scientific miracles kind of thing, it happens a lot in that department. But even in terms of linguistic miracles and things like that, it's like, okay, rather than approaching this in a curious way, in a questioning way, and being open to different possibilities, being open to a range of things, you have to find the one that's miraculous, which might not be really what the verse is about or what it's saying or the reason why that word is chosen. So yes, I certainly do engage in these two modes. But I just want to say that there is also a believer is not always reading it in that way. Like, so we're not incapable of engaging in historical critical studies. And in fact, historical critical studies maybe or historical critical HCM, right, the method might well be describing a particular outgrowth of Western studies, but I think our tradition has plenty of criticality, has plenty of historicizing in its place. So for me, that those ideas of being critical, well, I would get very angry at someone who's going to suggest that I'm not critical, like like whoever reviewed my last paper. They didn't say that I'm not, but I had one reviewer who rejected my last paper, which was eventually published, and they didn't say what their problem was, except they said they didn't like my approach and methodology. That's all that I was allowed to know from that reviewer, anonymous reviewer. And then that makes me question, okay, so what exactly is your problem with my my approach and methodology? And I can't help thinking that I came across as too much of a believer, and therefore the all the critical methods that I employed become undermined just because I took tafsir too seriously. I don't know what it is. I can only make assumptions, you see, and that's against a background of suspicion.
This is the Fight and Flights paper, right?
Fights and Flights, yeah. So,
Fights and Flights, yeah.
So, I did
receive
interesting... one rejection, which then we then found another reviewer, and it was accepted. But I'm sort of wondering about what was going on in the mind of that reviewer.
Yeah, it's such an interesting one as well, and I think you're right that there's, or I don't know, right? We don't know what this person's views of it were, but there is this kind of yeah, I mean, like a general suspicion about trying to understand the Quran from say a tafsir perspective, which, I mean, ultimately that's not a non-secular way of engaging with the text. I'm not sure if you're being comfortable being called secular in this sense, but it's like, look. I mean, so so if just because I know. I mean, it doesn't read to me that just because you take the text seriously or to take the text seriously, take this text as truth doesn't mean that you're looking at the tafsirs. Well, maybe to get to truth, but there's absolutely no assumption there saying that, well, these will certainly have a truth outside of the Quran. Like the Quran is a truth, right? And as the whatever the tafsirs are doing is something worth studying and something interesting and something where, of course, you can. I mean, there are wrong and correct interpretations of a text, and sometimes it's not easy to tell, and sometimes it becomes harder to tell if you're a believer, or less hard to tell when you're a believer, and these don't. Yeah, I just don't see a conflict there, and I think that's a more general thing, with the question of say miraculousness. I Well, I'm sure you've seen me, but I tend to get quite irritated with people who come at me and want to show that, I don't know, if you divide the Quran through 19 and then multiply it by 16 and then do some other mathematics, all of a sudden, look, Allah comes out. I don't know. This is to me.
And as a Muslim,
Mhm,
I also want to defend the Quran against weak arguments on its
mhm,
behalf.
yeah,
Because as soon as those arguments fall, then supposedly the Quran falls, if you based your
right,
belief in the Quran on the
right,
weak
right,
arguments.
right.
So, and people can get upset sometimes when I burst their bubble
Mhm,
on certain scientific miracles or even linguistic miracles. I'm saying, well,
mhm,
sometimes these linguistic things aren't taking into account the Qur'at, and I'm not
mhm,
okay with that. So, is it
mhm.
a miracle of Hafs? Is that what's happened here? So,
Right. Which is problematic in itself, because I mean, Hafs isn't a prophet or God or anything like that. So yeah, no,
so it
I
calls into
find.
question the method that was employed to reach that
Right.
conclusion. If
Exactly, and it's like, and if you can get those kinds of results from really problematic starting positions, it's like, well, what is it telling us about the method? I think there's other ways about it. Like if I can, I mean, and this is one of the questions that was in there as well. People talk about the study of the Quranic literature, to talk about its composition and these kinds of things, where I think
I can pull that up.
I think, yeah, let's see if we can find it. Yeah, so the Quranic literature and lurking question of Quranic authorship. Well, that's kind of a side question, but what
Hmm.
I wanted to get into is like, um, that's a kind of engagement. So every now and then you get these kind of engagements, say from Muslims, and even from say quite lay positions, where people kind of appreciate the deeper structure of the text and how a surah is composed together, and how that can lead to deeper appreciation of the text. And it's like, well, it doesn't necessarily look miraculous to me, but it certainly makes it literature, right? It certainly makes it a text that is not just the ramblings of a madman. I mean, that's not what's going on. Which when you see um, really bizarre translations from certain Christian apologists, it's just they assume that it's the ramblings of a madman, and therefore they
And
cannot
they make
even.
it sound that way in the way that
And they
they.
make it sound that way, exactly. And they absolutely did. And when they have an absolutely absurd translation, they don't even seem to realize it's an absurd translation, because they're like, well, it's the ravings of a madman anyway, so therefore that this verse doesn't make any
I'm
sense to
being
me.
faithful
Is
to
exactly,
the.
this is exactly
Yeah.
what it's supposed to be. And it's like, so that's a kind of appreciation of pattern that I like. And I think are there's interesting ways of engaging with this. This is, I had some um, a little bit of pushback from people when I talked about this so-called interpolation in Surat Maryam, where, I mean, actually the point I was making is like, if anyone interpolated it, was the prophet and nobody else, but people saw interpolation, they got angry.
Hmm.
Um, but
It's the word. It's the word interpolation. We don't like it.
Right, exactly.
The
So,
later
but I
revelation.
mean, but of course, I mean, I would say that the tradition itself actually recognizes prophetic interpolations. They don't necessarily do it here, but
Yeah.
some people approach it from the other side. It's like, look, there's this very clear rhyme in Surat Maryam, and then there's this strange break, and it has a different topic, and maybe that is part of the composition. The whole point was, this is a sidebar, so we will break the rhyme to make that sidebar, then to get back to the main story and put the rhyme back. I have no idea how to counter that argument, and I think it's a very nice way of kind of looking at the Quran as literature and kind of and seeing like, okay, well, no, actually, I mean, it looks like an interpolation because it's uh, an interpolation in the narrative, in the sense like, nobody put it in. Well, some would put it in there, God to Muslims, but it's it's a point, like this break is a point for reflection and that kind of thing. It's like, well, I don't know, that still doesn't strike me as miraculous, but it's at least something where I can see someone being in awe of the system or what's trying to be created, and
Okay.
where we're coming at it from a different perspective might help you, might lead you to not quite appreciate, the compositional system or structure of the
Yeah.
text. Yeah, something like
I
that.
mean, so I guess this question is very personal, and you can
Mm,
choose how or whether you you answer it as such. But so some of the questions were about like the specific
mm,
content, the propositions, the
mhm,
statements,
mhm,
the exhortations that the
mhm.
Quran is making. At any point, do you read that sort of allowing it to speak to you, or is it always seen as some words on a page?
I mean, I mean, to some extent, it is. It doesn't, like, I can appreciate the Quran. I can appreciate the Quran as a text. I can appreciate what it has to say. I can. I think I don't think it reads like the ravings of a madman. I think there's a very clear, well, not always clear, but certainly a kind of consistent worldview theology comes out of it, which is clearly engaging with other theologies that were around. And so I appreciate that, but no, it doesn't speak to me on a spiritual level, and no book does.
And it's
So
interesting because from
yeah.
a, again, like from a Muslim perspective,
Mm,
it's not. First of all, I think that we should, as Muslims, should always be welcoming that people who
mm,
read the Quran. Because if we believe in the Quran as
mhm.
this effective message, then we
Yeah,
just have to let it do its work and
right,
not
right.
doubt it so much, right?
Exactly. I mean, if it's true, it's true. So I mean,
Yeah, and,
it's
and and to
right.
be honest, that doesn't mean I believe we should hand out
Mm,
translations of the Quran on the street, and
mm,
I don't think
mm.
that's a very effective way of doing things. It might be confusing,
Why
but
not? Why not? Why don't you think that's
um,
effective?
well, first of all, that's not the mode that the Prophet, peace be upon him,
Mm,
was
mm,
conveying
mhm.
Islam, right? To give people a final,
Right.
a copy of Quran, and then of course you start reading the Fatiha and then Al-Baqarah, and for sure there are people who read the Quran that way in translation, and it affected them, became Muslims, and so there's no problem with
Mm,
it. I don't
mm,
have, but I'm just saying, I don't think that in the first place someone should be given a whole book to read. Instead
mhm,
of just having a
mm,
conversation with them and let them understand what it is that you're about
mhm,
and what's the
mhm,
basic proposition, the message, the key message, I think is what
mhm,
needs to be shared with people. But like, I'm not scared of people reading the Quran.
mhm.
There are Muslims who are scared of Muslims reading the Quran.
Right.
There are
Right.
scholars who are telling Muslims don't read translations of Quran. You'll be
Right.
misguided, and I have to feel that this is a very deviant and blasphemous perspective.
Mm,
But by extension, I think we shouldn't be afraid that non-Muslims are reading,
mm,
and but at the same time, they will only benefit. As the Quran
mhm.
says, "Hudan lil muttaqin." It is
Yeah.
guidance. It's guidance for everyone
Right.
on some level, but in reality, only those who will be guided whom God wills to guide. And there is something about the person's own mode of engagement that will encourage that or not. There are some people who will be misguided by the Quran. Yes, actually, this is mentioned, but only the
Mhm.
fasiqeen, right?
Right. Right.
So
Right. Right.
ultimately, I see that the Quran is guidance for people. So, but at the same time, I know that it's not like an automatic process or something.
Mhm,
I
mhm,
remember
mhm,
like when I was much younger. So let's see, 16 years ago, I invited one academic over from. I mean, I don't think she'll mind I mention her name. It's Dr.
mm,
Christina Nelson. She's the author of The Art of Reciting the Quran, and she wrote this amazing book which I read, and I was like amazed that this person, this non-Muslim person, I was reading it, I was thinking maybe she's secretly a Muslim. I don't know, right? But
right.
maybe
Right.
she is. I don't know. But she's interviewed like Abdul Basit and
Mhm,
Minshawi and people like that, and she's written so sensitively and insightfully about the phenomenon of Quran recitation, and I still recommend that book. So I brought her over from Egypt for a tour in the UK, and she spoke in SOAS, Cambridge, and Edinburgh University. And at the end of the tour, I remember I thought, look, Sohaib, you've got to do some da'wah here. God is going to ask
mhm,
you about this, right? So we were on a train, and I just asked her in a gentle way that, don't you ever, like, you're writing about the Quran, doesn't it ever impact you? Like, do you not ever ask yourself whether it's true? And her answer was roughly that, well, it's just not the question that I ask. It's not a question that I really think about.
And that's very much the same for me. I
I
just
said, you must think about it before you die. Well, I don't know. I'm sure I was more polite than that, but yeah,
but it's the same. I don't engage with the text in that way. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so at the end of the day, that's life, you know. But you know, I hope you do sometime. But then who's going to make you? You know, that's your own choice, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
All right, shall we see what else?
Yeah.
Trying to move on from this awkward part of it.
Nah, it's not awkward. I don't mind talking about this. It's fun.
Well, that's good. You know, I think that I've seen, like, and you mentioned to me as well that it's more a problem when people say on Twitter and so on, feel entitled.
Yeah.
Question.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
What is your belief? You know, ultimately.
Yeah. No, I mean that's a very central thing to me. So I get asked every now and then, you know, are you Muslim? And sometimes the wording there is like, are you Muslim? And if not, how dare you, study this stuff? And sometimes it's a genuine question. But the feeling, I mean, I'm more irritated in the first case than the second one. Ultimately, it's like, well, that's you're a random no name on Twitter, and it's like that's not none of your business, which isn't, I mean, right now, I'm being open about it, but I'm handling it in that sense, and it's like, people are not entitled to knowing what's in my mind. I'm happy to share it, and it's not particularly private thing to me, and
your opinion doesn't matter anyway, so
yeah, right, exactly.
Let's try to touch on these two topics. So let's leave the qira'at now, because we went there a little bit. But one of the questions is about, so you've mentioned a little bit about Quran's engagement with biblical materials and how that's related to the literature question. Again, that's a very big topic, but there's also a question about extra biblical material. The Dhul Qarnayn example is given a lot. So, I mean, I don't know how much we can really say about that, but I guess maybe on a high level, we can touch on this question. And the other one was about grammatical mistakes. So let's start with like something like Dhul Qarnayn. What did you want to say about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is one of the fascinating things about the Quran, and it's I don't know. Sometimes it's seen as inherently at odds with being able to engage with the text as a Muslim, but I'm not sure if that's true. But I am absolutely convinced by scholarship that has looked at the Dhul Qarnayn story, that it is talking about Alexander from the Alexander romance, and that's the important part. It's talking about the fictional Alexander, and not the historical Alexander, which is difficult to. Well, I mean, I don't know if it's difficult to square, but it makes for it makes for having to look at the text in a different way. And maybe you want to say something about it. But clearly, like, the Quran is engaging with stories that are known and that were known before the 7th century. There are some pushes and polemical attempts by people who are disturbed by the fact that Alexander is in the Quran, and they try to turn it around and say, well, actually, the Alexander romance is based on the Quran. But that really doesn't seem to be the case. And so we have this story, and the same is true with the infancy gospels. Like, clearly the Quran's engaging, but also remixing the infancy gospels. And of course you could say, well, I mean, this is the actual story that actually happened, and these infancy gospels kind of got the message and got round to it. But these are really late infancy gospels, right? They're much later than what we have from the gospels. They're much later from Jesus'
So were it not
lifetime.
for the Quran, there wouldn't be particular reason to assume that they were more correct.
Right, exactly. I mean, so nobody, right now, nobody in Christianity believes that these infancy gospels have even anything remotely to a truth claim. And of course, it's showing up in the Quran again to a Christian, or people working in biblical studies in general, I should say, would not be convinced that, well, clearly there's something going on with those gospels. It's just, no, the author of the Quran knew these infancy gospels and was using them.
Yeah, I mean, you've already shed light on the fact that these things can be looked at from different angles, and you might characterize a certain view,
Right.
way of doing it as apologetic, and that's fine. I don't think it's necessarily a bad word. I think for me, I'm not so much involved in polemics and apologetics as I am in, again, trying to get to the truth of things. Even if that truth starts to make you uncomfortable, then you investigate also the source of that discomfort. What is it that's under threat here? For me, none of that threatens my belief in the Quran as wahi, as revelation. I can understand how it can be used by those who don't believe in the Quran as wahi to present another way of putting it. I totally get that. But the fact that the Quran, first of all, engages with things which are biblical and and accepted and believed in by the people of the book, as the Quran puts it, that part is much more straightforward, because the Quran is pretty much telling you that it's doing that. And then what's sort of changed is some interpretations of how it's doing that and why it's doing that and to what end and in what ways, because again, this has become a sort of trope as well, that earlier scholars were talking about the Quran borrowing from biblical material and then garbling and kind of confusing things and getting figures mixed up, whereas now it's far more common to find that scholars are saying, well, this is a creative reworking, this is a subversion of that material. So I think if we allow for an evolution of this view, and I think when it comes to the biblical material, as Muslims, we should definitely be involved in this, especially this part here. I call it tasdeeq studies, because the Quranic word for what the Quran is doing with the earlier scripture is musaddiqan lima bayna yadayhi. So musaddiq, tasdeeq. Therefore, we can revisit what does tasdeeq consist of. Right? Is it just affirming and confirming the truth of what's been said, or does the whole range of things that the Quran is doing with the biblical material fall under tasdeeq? Then, based on what we get out of that analysis, can we then apply some thought process to what's happening with extra biblical material and the likes of legends and romances and things like that? Because here again, a very linear, simplistic view of historicity and what the Quran counts, what's Quranic history, can be disturbed by observing things like that. And the example that's sometimes given as well, that something that's originally from the Mishnah about killing one person is killing all of humanity, is then the Quran says katabna alayhim fiha, right? So it's almost like it was written for them in the Torah, it sounds like, right? Whereas it's not in the written Torah, it is in a way the oral Torah, but katabna alayhim. So that either you can say, well, the Quran is wrong, or you say, well, now we have to refine our idea of katabna, or what Allah means when he talks about kitab and kitaba, right? What does that entail? Now and already, you go to the books of Wujuh and Nadha'ir, they will tell you kitab means 12 different things in the Quran, right? So it shouldn't be that much of a disaster to say, well, maybe it means one more thing, or we refine our ideas. So on that basis, I think opening that question about Dhul Qarnayn, for example, I had a several part discussion. I'll just advertise it here. If you go to Bayina TV, bayina.tv, some colleagues, I will say in the Tasdeeq Studies department, we have gone through various theories about Dhul Qarnayn and how we understand it, and in particular the Alexander theories and how we understand the relationship to the Romans. I don't remember all the details of that because it's not my main topic or interest. But we have been open to the view that the Dhul Qarnayn story is really more about a type or archetype of person rather than about one historical person. And the relationship then to Alexander is there and is intended, but it's not the sole referent or the sole purpose of the story. So what I would say is here, in apologetics and in, it's all about, I must give you a definite answer
Right.
in order to prove that you're wrong or your contention is wrong and that I'm right. It's just not my way of doing things. I'm not against apologetics or apologists. I'm really not. Same team, guys. But what I'm saying is, I won't indulge in that mode, because I think as a person involved in scholarship, I'm called upon to do something else, which is to remain ever curious and ever open to exploring possibilities and critiquing those possibilities, trying to reach the right conclusion. So maybe what I argue today, I realize later, is not the best argument. But then if I'm staking the whole truth of the religion on my argument in the course of this debate, then I've jeopardized the religion by doing so. So I would just say this deserves more study, and Muslim scholarship is able to work around that, to incorporate new methods.
Yeah, and to just a point to make there. Sometimes, I mean, we're talking, say apologetics. That kind of incorporation is kind of felt like a, and I think you've said it quite nicely, but it's worth putting it a bit stronger even. It sometimes felt like a kind of ceding to say secular scholarship, and it's like, well, now we have to find a way around. But it's not, it's not non-Muslims like throwing problems across the fence, like go solve this for yourself and figure out how to think about this. That's I mean, seeing it in that kind of adversarial sense, I think is the wrong way to approach it.
I think non-Muslim scholars, for the most part, are talking to each other about how they want to understand it.
Right.
That's the way I see it.
Yeah.
It's not about challenging Muslims or disturbing Muslims in their faith.
No. I don't think so either. But well, let's say in polemics, or I don't know, politics, whatever, they like pointing to these kind of things, of course, because a strictly historical interpretation, if you accept the facts, is difficult, and you have to find some way around it. But it's like, but that's not I don't know, Christian knowledge, right, or non-Muslim knowledge. That is, these are the facts that we have, and we need to figure out how to go about this. And of course, whether you come at that, from a non-Muslim perspective or a Muslim perspective, will have to be like, well, clearly, I mean, the Quran is true, so whatever is going on here, or is revelation, let's put it like that, has to be understood in some kind of context. But it's not so, and I don't. Well, it's not necessarily like, sometimes you end up with really tortured explanations, like, well, now you're just trying to fit in whatever is true to make it still be true. But that's certainly not, not how I perceive your approach to this kind of thing, and not how Muslims in general approach these kinds of things.
I mean, on the one hand, you can kind of say, look, this is how we can understand it and still be strong. But then it's another thing when they say, and now I've refuted the Orientalists. That's where people tend to go too fast. Let's put it that way. While it's still an open debate, because things are even the data is still incomplete. Like, we don't have all the information about all these documents, and we have parts that come up and then raise questions. But maybe there's another document still to be discovered that will actually explain everything and will completely clarify how the Quran is completely true. Maybe that will happen. But in the absence of that, secular scholarship operates on what is there, right? And Islamic scholarship just continues to operate on its basic core tenets, which are not shaken.
Right. No, I agree. So this has been good.
All right,
let's do the last one. Huh?
Let's do the last one, because we've both got, I think, fun answers to this. A topic of interest, debated a lot over the years, is whether the Quran contains grammatical mistakes. And I think he knows, I think he had a feeling that it was you, because he said the concept of grammatical mistakes may open a can of worms for a linguist. All right, do you want to start off on this?
Sure.
Does the Quran contain grammatical mistakes, Marijn? This is
So no, it doesn't, because grammatical mistakes don't exist. But let me put this in a slightly more of a context. So
there ain't no grammatical mistakes. You're saying
there ain't no grammatical mistakes, indeed. So as a linguist, we're interested in describing language as it is used. And that means that we're also interested in non-standard ways of doing things. So, as you just alluded to, there ain't no mistakes. That's non-standard English, but there's nothing inherently wrong about that English. It's not the way you're supposed to write, and I suggest, if you apply for a job at a university or anywhere else, you don't write like that. But that's purely social, right? And it could have been different. It could have been that the ain't no construction rather than there is no would have been the standard form, and there is no would have been considered non-standard. There's absolutely no rational way of deciding this is correct, this is wrong. So then when you go to the Quran and you see something which is grammatically weird, it's like, okay, why do I think this is weird? Well, first of all, you look, okay, does the same construction happen elsewhere in the Quran, and is it the same? Well, so with the famous one, Inna hadani la sahirani, it should have been hadani by classical Arabic standards, but it's the only time that hadani occurs in the Quran. So for me as a descriptive person, I'm like, okay, well, clearly from what we can see in the Quran, hadani simply does not have a genitive accusative
Hold on.
mark. Okay.
That's not the Quran. The Quran says in hadani lasahiran, right?
Well, okay. So then there's the other side, of course, there's different readings there.
So there's no mistake in hadani lasahiran.
Yes,
Talking about the Quran, that's a different thing. Yeah. This is Hafsa
So-
normativity. Yeah. Sometimes you wish people would just go to Hafsa normativity. So what you're describing is, a question, not necessarily a problem, but a question that faces some of the readings.
Right.
And I guess it was possible for everyone just to say in hadani lasahiran and avoid
The issue.
that.
I guess, I mean, that one has its own issues.
But then you have to sort of understand a sort of
La as illa. Yeah.
or
no,
in,
so
or you understand in as mukhaffafa min al-thaqila. But then its meaning is inna, but it's not function. It doesn't have the agency or the effect.
Yeah.
So I think that's related to our question here also, which is, yes, in a way, you could say the Quran doesn't contain that problem and that mistake. Because look, actually what the Quran is saying is in hadhan li-sahiran. But some of the readers, and therefore, multiples of people and grammarians are reported to have recited inna hadhani li-sahiran. So then they obviously did not feel it's ungrammatical.
Right, which is an important point, right? And it's like that's not necessarily just because later.
But my beginner's Arabic book that I did, Al-Kitab, Volume 1, not Sibawayh's Kitab, but the University Al-Kitab, told me that you have to do, the accusative after inna. So it must be, the Quran must be wrong.
So this exactly. So this makes for so we have to be very careful not to impose later standards. I mean, whatever we make of it, like Sibawayh, even if Sibawayh would be saying that this is wrong, who isn't saying this is wrong, and neither is Al-Farra. They explain it in ways that I find nonsensical. So the Farra says, well, this is just some dialect, Al-Harith, I think, but Al-Harith. And it's like, well, why would there suddenly be that in the Quran, and that doesn't really get explained? So I don't think I have a satisfying answer to what is going on. But actually, purely from a Quranic internal perspective, we just don't have any evidence that hadani as a form exists, only in the readings. Of course, Abu reads that way. And we get a couple of others like this as well. And there's other places where we get both options, but we get both options once. It's like, well, maybe this was just an option and it was just free variation. There are sometimes multiple ways of saying the same thing in any language. It's like, is one way of saying it wrong and the other one correct? I don't know. Of course, that doesn't take away that there can be mistakes in the Quran. In principle, at least, coming at it, well, I think even coming at it from a Muslim perspective, I think you can do this. It's Uthman who had the Quran standardized and is not necessarily the precise and exact words. There might be mistakes in there. There's traditions that say, there's mistakes in the Uthmanic text, which, by now have been considered weak and all kinds of stuff. But there you kind of wondered, like, okay, well, is it weak because they don't like the meaning or don't like the tradition?
Well, yeah, let's say the extent to which I would accept that proposition is, well, first of all, there's no mistakes in the Quran as the Quran.
Right.
The fact that readers themselves preferred some readings over others, that's one thing, but occasionally would say about another reading that that's a mistake,
Right.
then that reading becomes canonized and it becomes above dispute. But the point is, I don't then, back project a kind of takfir on the person who said it's a mistake. They might be right on some level, but at the same time, I see that the Quran is preserved through the totality of its readings and not necessarily through one reading at a time. So the Quran is still there. The readings are attempts to vocalize it correctly. And there can be, so I think people, and again, I don't say this in order to cast doubts in people's mind or whatever, but I'm just saying, as someone who works also with tafsir, we have this whole discourse of the Quran is easy, the Quran is clear, the Quran is simple to understand and stuff like that. Well, yes, many things and the fundamentals and many ayat are like that. But you know what? Just read some tafsir and you'll see like how many things are really very open questions and scholars struggle with and differ over. Like, what exactly is this word and this phrase mean? They could argue about it forever and they still haven't come to the conclusion. So I guess where is he? Thomas Bauer and his Culture of Ambiguity. I haven't actually, I'm not promoting it, but I haven't actually read it yet. But I like the title so much that I bought the book. I'm really interested in what he has to say, because I think that's one of the keys that has been lost in our appreciation of that. To the point that, you know what? I don't believe that the qira'at have got grammatical mistakes. Conceptually, a single qira'ah of a single verse can have grammatical error. I might agree with the Tabari when he's talking about, was it 6137?
137, yes.
Yeah, Zuyina, all of that. So in this ayah, maybe he's right to say that this is like, unacceptable. Now, now that it became canonized, can that still be said? Well, you know what, we generally won't say that. But to me, it's a bit like, although this is maybe overstretching the analogy, but, Al-Bukhari and Muslim, for all intents and purposes, we just say the hadith of Bukhari and Muslim are sahih, and that's really the end of the discussion. We don't have to go into it more. But scholars know, scholars have always known it's not as simple as that. These things were not brought down by angels, but they were put together by human beings, brilliant human beings, expert human beings. And there's a process, and there's also a value in the collective acceptance of something by the ummah and its propagation and proliferation. Okay, all of that is fine, but does that mean that never can a hadith in Bukhari be reproachable? Well, that's where actually scholars would say, well, quietly, but don't tell the awam, because they will get confused. So yeah, I hope the awam are not watching this video. We should probably stop there before things get worse.
Yeah.
Any
No,
concluding thoughts?
Yeah, no. So just a final thought on that is I mean, so it's, right. It's central. It is common for readings to be criticized and be called incorrect, and they are incorrect by the standards of the people critiquing them at the time.
And they're called grammatically incorrect at times.
And they're called grammatically incorrect.
That's one of the
sources. So you see this, and it's like, well, but it's a 4th century person talking about a 10th century person. Yes, let me get this right. A 10th century person or 11th century person talking about a 7th century text, and that's not necessarily. I mean, just because they believe this doesn't necessarily make it true. At the same time, they can have very good arguments for it. It's like, well, there's nothing like it in the Quran. It's a very strange construction. I think that's a good argument to say at least there's something strange going on here. There's something strange going on with this reading, especially if there's other readings which have perfectly grammatically valid solutions. So there can be mistakes. It's just, what do you call a mistake and what don't you call a mistake? And well, there's many things that get called a mistake. And I'm like, well, that doesn't even register as a mistake. It's just, your textbook failed to describe it, which there's lots of things in the Quran that your textbook fails to describe. So, there's a thing to worry about. So anyway, so that's kind of my thoughts on grammatical mistakes. I don't think there are any.
And I
don't.
will,
But
I
of
will,
course, now that I've said this, I'll be clipped, and everybody's like,
yeah,
linguist has says there's no mistakes in the Quran. It's like, yeah, that's true, but there's no mistakes in any other
yeah, by
book either.
definition.
That's the important point. There's no mistakes. There's no
Yeah,
such thing. We don't make mistakes. Yeah.
yeah. Well, good. Well, I would like to end by repenting of anything I've said that violates orthodoxy. I did not mean it, and I retract it immediately. But ultimately, I hope that through our discussion, I've enjoyed it a lot, and I think
That's
people
good.
following along hopefully got to understand that, I was about to say something really cliche like this. We have more in common than we have to differ on, but
I'll
it's
take
just
it.
that you can actually have a meeting of minds that is not coming from a place of shared belief or even shared methodologies, but you have something. You have collegiality also in the wider Quranic studies community. We didn't really talk about Muslim Quranic studies
Mhm.
as it exists in some other places and countries and so on. But certainly within our Western Quranic studies type of community, there are different trends and approaches and people you get on with more than others. I probably get on more with you than others, but I don't
Mhm.
have also any beef with anybody, inshallah.
Mhm.
But I hope that also some of those people following along got to see also some of the dynamics of these immigrants
Mhm.
into Quranic studies as well, and
Yeah.
how we see ourselves fitting in. And that's I'm giving my personal perspective, but probably others would agree with at least some of that. So thanks a lot,
Yes. Thank you so much. It was a lot of fun.
and let's see what comments. Should we leave comments open or closed? Let's leave them open. And
Let's leave them open. We'll
yeah.
see what happens. I think it'll be good.
We'll see if
I
we get
think
anything for
yes.
for a subsequent discussion.
Yes.
All right,
All
cheers.
right.
All right, bye
Thank
now.
you.